Now, in the record of the kings of Israel and Judah, there is not one king of Israel that God said did right in God's eyes, following the division of Israel into two separate kingdoms. In the southern kingdom of Judah, there were, however, a few bright lights, those who are said to have done what was right in the Lord's eyes. Now, one of those brighter lights was King Jehoshaphat. Now, the Bible does not hold back in recording his strengths and weaknesses. Now, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:11 that the stories of the Old Testament were written as examples and written for our warning, on whom the ends of the world have come. So in the sermon at time today, I'd like to take a look at the life of Jehoshaphat and see what lessons that we can learn from his life. The division of Israel into two separate kingdoms, with Israel in the north and Judah in the south, occurred around 929 BC. Jeroboam became king of the 10 tribes in the north, while Solomon's son Rehoboam became king of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem, which also included the tribes of Benjamin and Levi. Now, in the southern kingdom of Judah, Rehoboam was briefly succeeded by Abijam, and then by the 41-year rule of Jehoshaphat's father, Asa. Now, one of the most dramatic events in Asa's reign that would have made a deep impression on Jehoshaphat was the defeat of the enormous 1 million man Ethiopian and Libyan army under Zerah. Now, this force was likely to have been a mercenary army of the Egyptians, who often controlled Ethiopia and Libya. At Mareshah, southwest of Jerusalem, Asa cried out to God for intervention against this great army that greatly outnumbered them. And God struck the enemy, and they were all destroyed. Now, this for a time freed the land of Israel from the hegemony of Egypt, brought about by the conquest of Shishak, and not reasserted again until the time of Jehoram. Now, Asa died around about 868 BC, and Jehoshaphat then began his sole rule over Judah. Now, he started off very well, as we'll read here in 2 Chronicles 17, starting from verse 2, where it says, "And he placed troops in all the fortified cities of Judah, and set troops in the land of Judah and in the cities of Ephraim, which Asa his father had taken. And the Lord was with Jehoshaphat, because he walked in the first ways of his father David, and did not seek after the Baalim. But he sought to the God of his father, and walked in his commandments, and not according to the practices of Israel. Therefore the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought presents to Jehoshaphat. And he had great riches and honour, and his heart delighted in the ways of the Lord. And he took away the high places and groves out of Judah." Now, after starting off so well in chapter 17, Jehoshaphat then begins making some poor decisions, starting in the next chapter in 2 Chronicles chapter 18. Starting in verse 1, we read, "And Jehoshaphat had riches and honour in abundance, and he contracted a marriage with Ahab. And after some years he went down to Ahab in Samaria. And Ahab killed sheep and oxen in abundance for him and for the people that were with him. And he persuaded him to go with him up to Ramoth Gilead. And Ahab, king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, 'Will you go with me up to Ramoth Gilead?' And he answered him and said, 'I am as you, and my people are as your people, and we will go with you in the war.' Now King Ahab of Israel had married the Baal-worshipping, wicked Queen Jezebel. Now Jehoshaphat makes an alliance with Ahab and seals it with a marriage between his son Jehoram and Ahab and Jezebel's daughter Athaliah, who is also a Baal worshipper. They are now connected, related through this marriage. Matthew Henry, in his commentary, gives his opinion about this. He writes, His religion forbade him to marry his son to a daughter of any of the heathen princesses that were about him. Thou shalt not take their daughters to thy sons. And having riches and honour in abundance, he thought it a disparagement to marry him to a subject. A king's daughter it must be, and therefore Ahab's, little considering that Jezebel was her mother. Now some think he did it in policy, hoping by this expedient to unite the kingdoms in his son. Ahab perhaps flattering him with hopes that he would make him his heir when he intended to do no such thing. Jehoshaphat then also agreed to go up to Ramoth Gilead with Ahab to take it back from the king of Syria. In verse 4, perhaps feeling a twinge of conscience to check that it was okay with God, asks if there is a prophet of the Lord to inquire about this matter. 400 of the prophets allied to Ahab say that it's okay, but Jehoshaphat wants to hear it from someone who is a prophet of the Lord. They send for Micaiah, who Ahab dislikes terribly. Micaiah then tells of a vision where a lying spirit is allowed to tempt Ahab via his prophets to go up to Ramoth Gilead so that he would be killed and that Israel would be scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Now, despite Micaiah's warning, we read in verse 28, and the king of Egypt and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. Jehoshaphat went ahead with his alliance with Ahab despite the prophet's warning. Now, Ramoth Gilead was on the eastern edge of the territory originally given to Manasseh, but was now in the hands of the Syrians. Now, this was not Judah's territory, and the reacquisition of it was between God and the people of Israel. As predicted by Micaiah, King Ahab is shot by an arrow and dies. Now, God protected Jehoshaphat in the battle, but he's got some stern correction for him after the battle. In 2 Chronicles 19, starting from verse 2, we read, And Jehu, the son of Hananiah, the seer, went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, Should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Because of this, wrath has gone out against you from the Lord. Nevertheless, some good is found in you, for you destroyed the Ashtaroth out of the land and have set your heart to seek God. Jehoshaphat lived at Jerusalem, and he went out among the people from Beersheba to the hill country of Ephraim and brought them back to the Lord, the God of their fathers. Now, a Jewish history website commenting on this says, in his sincere desire for peace, Jehoshaphat concluded an alliance with Ahab, king of Israel. This union was strengthened by the daughter of Jehoram, son and heir of Jehoshaphat, to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab. Though this achievement seemed a great triumph for his policy, inasmuch as it has for a while terminated the continual warfare that had so long raged between Judah and Israel, it nevertheless contained the seeds of evil repercussions upon the moral standards of his people. End of quote. Now, Jehoshaphat repeated a mistake that was committed by his father Asa. Now, after that famous battle at Mashera, where Zerah and his army were destroyed, Asa sought help against the king of Syria from the king of Israel, rather than relied on God. And this is a mistake that Jehoshaphat now repeats. Jehoshaphat was a good man, but he had a weakness in being willing to ally himself with others who were opposed to God's ways. The Apostle Paul speaks about this tendency over in 2 Corinthians 6 and verses 14 and 15. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship does righteousness have with lawlessness? And what partnership does light have with darkness? And what agreement does Christ have with Belial? Or what part does a believer with an unbeliever? The Grace to You website on this verse comments that the primary warning is to never link up with an unbeliever in spiritual pursuits. So the obvious thing, first of all, is to avoid any common spiritual enterprise with an unbeliever, including things like marriage or religious ecumenism. And then secondarily, to be very careful in other areas of life, like business, if you're pulling the same yoke with an unbeliever, because it's inevitable that there will be conflict, since the standard by which you operate is inherently different. Darian Cooper, in her book How to Be Happy Though Young, makes the following comments about this verse. God gives an illustration of being unequally yoked in Deuteronomy 22, verse 10. The agricultural example points out how a donkey and an ox do not make a good team. The nature of a donkey is different to that of an ox. They could never plough together smoothly. The same is true for a believer and a believer becoming a team in marriage. Their goals and purposes in life are different, and they'll be pulling in opposite directions, a tug of war, instead of going in the same direction. God doesn't want that for you. Now in 1 Corinthians 7:39, Paul is more specific about how this principle applies to marriage when he says, a wife should stay married to her husband until he dies. Then she is free to marry again, but only to a man who is a follower of the Lord. Now, it is tough for singles in the church with the reduced number of members that we've had in the last 20 years to be faithful to this. As an older single man, I can certainly empathise. If we are single, do we treat this merely as a good suggestion or as a matter of obedience to God, regardless of the odds of finding someone? Now, the only reason that God tells us not to do certain things is for our own good. And even with a good non-member spouse, there is one major drawback for someone who has committed themselves to God. If you have a deep passion for God, you will not be able to deeply share the most important part of your life with that person. Now, God would love much better for you than that. Now, if He chooses to, God can convert someone that you might like outside the church. But until that happens, we should remain obedient and not become unequally yoked ahead of when He might do such a miracle. If we impatiently take matters into our own hands, we are effectively putting the cart before the horse. Jehoshaphat, in his human reasoning, thought his best option was a spiritually unequal alliance, rather than having faith in God and trusting Him to provide what was needed. In matters of the heart, we should trust God by obeying Him and trusting Him to provide the right one, rather than relying on our own human reasoning. Now, the next great event in Jehoshaphat's life is told over in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. After Ahab's death, Ammon, Moab and Edom formed a triple alliance and crossed around the Dead Sea to do battle against Judah and Jehoshaphat. The enemies planned a surprise attack via the ascent of Ziz, that steep bridge that ascends from the Dead Sea near the spring of En-Gedi. Now, here's a short clip showing what that ascent is like and just how steep it is.
This is where the ascent of Ziz climbs up from the Dead Sea.
I just... yeah.
We just climbed the ascent of Ziz.
Nations from the east, Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites, made a sneak attack on Judah and arrived at En-Gedi. The enemy began to come up the ascent of Ziz. King Jehoshaphat of Judah called upon the Lord. The Lord told Jehoshaphat that Judah would not even have to fight in this battle. Instead of the army, Jehoshaphat sent singers in the front line. They went out past Tekoa, praising the Lord. The enemy had turned against each other. All Judah had to do was go out and pick up the spoil.
After Ahab's death, his son Ahaziah was the next king of Israel. At the end of chapter 20 of 2 Chronicles, we read how, in keeping with his friendly relations with Israel, Jehoshaphat agreed to Ahaziah's proposal to build a large merchant marine base at Ezion-Geber on the Red Sea. However, God's anger was again provoked by this renewal of business relations with the idolatrous king of Israel. A storm destroyed the fleet to the last ship, and all the crews were lost. But this time Jehoshaphat learned his lesson. So when Ahaziah approached him to reconstruct the merchant fleet, he flatly refused. Now, following the death of King Ahab, the Moabites, who are under tribute to the northern kingdom of Israel, rebelled against Israel. Now, this is confirmed in the Mesha or Moabite stone. And on this particular Mesha stela is mentioned Mesha, the king of Moab, Ahab, Ahab's father Omri, the tribe of Gad, and the house of David. Israel's new king Jehoram called on Jehoshaphat to assist him to deal with the revolt by Moab, who had rebuilt their army following God's deliverance of Judah near Tekoa. Now the story is told over in 2 Kings in chapter 3. The king of Edom also joined them, and going via the wilderness of Edom, things got really drastic with the lack of water, much like today. The prophet Elijah just happened to be in the area at the time. So let's pick up the story, starting from verse 14. And Elisha said, "As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, surely if it were not for the regard that I have for the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would not even look toward you nor see you." So he's copying a bit of an attitude here. "And now bring me a minstrel." And it happened when the minstrel played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. And he said, "So says the Lord, make this valley full of ditches. For so says the Lord, you shall not see wind, nor shall you see rain. Still that valley shall be filled with water so that you may drink, both you and your cattle and your animals. And this is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. And he will also deliver you, the Moabites, into your hand." And dropping down to verse, it says, "And it happened in the morning when the food offering was offered, behold, water came by the way of Edom, and the whole country was filled with water." Now this miracle demonstrates a principle by which God will intervene for us. He often wants to see a demonstration of our faith before he miraculously intervenes. He told these people here to dig ditches and fill the valley full of them, and then he would supply the water, which he did the next day. Now, after Jehoshaphat died, he was succeeded by his son Jehoram, who had married Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah. Now, Jehoram reigned for 8 years and did evil in God's eyes like the kings of Israel, as did his son who ruled for a year, before Jezebel's daughter Athaliah took over and ruled for 6 years. And she was quite the wicked, murderous ruler. Now that whole sad legacy could have been prevented if only Jehoshaphat had not had arranged for his son to marry into Ahab's family. So in conclusion, let's summarise a few of the lessons that we can learn from Jehoshaphat's life. Now Jehoshaphat was a good man who delighted in God's ways, and he was passionate about teaching his people God's ways. This is a wonderful quality that we should all look to emulate. Now, like his father Asa did when Zerah threatened Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat was willing to call on God to intervene in battle, which God did when he destroyed the Triple Alliance near Tekoa. Likewise, we should diligently seek God to help us with fighting our battles. However, like his father Jehoshaphat, he had a weakness in being willing to compromise and ally himself with others who are opposed to God's ways. We should learn from this and do as Paul taught by not being unequally yoked with unbelievers. And finally, one last lesson that we can learn from his life and the story of the provision of water in the desert is that often we have to dig a ditch and do our part to demonstrate our faith in God before he sends the water or whatever intervention that we are seeking from him.